abstention. Does that count, Meryl? If I get... I am... What did who said I do not choose to run, I will not stand if I'm chosen? Was it Teddy Roosevelt? Somebody said that. Some president. I will not stand if chosen. I will not serve if elected. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 30th anniversary commemoration of the Nuclear Free Zone. We're going to have quite a variety of presentations tonight. There's going to be some poetry, a little music, a little jog down memory lane, an update as to the current situation, and then the future, what's going to happen. Hopefully. And my name's Jay Levy. I'm chair of the Nuclear Free Zone Committee in Tacoma Park. And at this point, I'd like to introduce the Tacoma Park Poet Laureate, Merrill Leffler, who's written a poem especially commemorating tonight. He has been the Tacoma Park Poet Laureate for 3 years, since 2010. And he runs Dryad Press, which is a national poetry publishing house here in Tacoma Park. And his most recent book of poems is entitled Mark the Music. And Merrill?
Jay, can we give him the mic?
He's going to speak from here.
First of all, I want to thank Historic Tacoma and the Nuclear Free Zone Committee for inviting not me, but the position of Poet Laureate. I've said before, and I just want to make one remark, that while it's an honor, and I'm the third Poet Laureate in Tacoma Park. Don Berger was the first, and Ann Becker was the second. It's really a tribute to the city of Tacoma Park that we have this position, because it's a recognition of the importance of the arts, as we see in the community center, with art itself, the visual arts, and but also for poetry and literature. I'm going to read a poem that is called Confrontation, appropriate for Tacoma Park and appropriate for, at least I think, the Nuclear Free Zone, and it's subtitled On the 30th Year of Tacoma Park as a Nuclear Free Zone. I want to say, a poem should be self-explanatory, but I just want to say one thing. There are two voices here. There is a first voice, which is the accuser, the political, the polity, the authorities. And then there is a second voice, and that voice is the poem. And that poem, I would like to think, is the spirit of Tacoma Park and the spirit of those of us who are here and others who are not here tonight, who stand up in the face of sometimes mockery that we are a nuclear-free zone. And, okay, so now I will read you this poem, which has a couple of epigraphs. And the epigraphs, one is from political, and one is a poet. The first is from John Kennedy, President Kennedy. If more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I am convinced the world would be a little better place in which to live. And of course he said little. He wasn't making great, immense claims. And then an epigraph from the poet, wonderful poet, Galway Kinnell, who wrote, if a poem is to be useful, it has to give hope. But it is to be realistic, it has to cause despair. So this is the first part, and again, think of the voice as the authority, the polity. Addressing poetry. Listen up, poetry. Who invited you here? We're talking terrorists and nuclear weapons. We're talking the real world of enemies and war and mutually assured destruction and nuclear utilization target selection. What are you going to rhyme those with? Or nuclear fission, or plutonium, or U-235. We've got a nation to defend. What do you defend while we're out here doing the real work? A poem? A reputation? What do you know of deterrence and first strike capability? You're out there on a branch I'm sorry, you're out there on a branch where the late sweet bird sang, you're still quoting Shakespeare, or up in a tower away from it all like Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. What are you but a word machine churning out elegies and love songs, and even useless political poems, as if they could matter in the rural world? You moon about imagining the day-long voice of Eve in the piney woods, while we're doing the real work of survival. In the real world, it's an eye for an eye, a bomb for a bomb, or two or three. What do? You agonize over your little lyrics, your sonnets, your villanelles. Face up to it, you're an entertainer, and a wordy one at that. You make goo-goo eyes at metaphor and sidle up to her as though she were flesh and blood. The real flesh and blood is out there and wants to kill you. A bomb is a bomb is a bomb. That's real. A rose is a rose is a rose is poetic nonsense. Go back where you belong, out on a branch somewhere, on a cold hillside, moaning over La Belle Dame sans Merci, who left you there with your little poems on the loss of innocence. So that's the accuser. This is the poem, or I would say the spirit behind the poem. Listen, you cynical old Paul, I live in the same world as you. This world of corporate greed and hunger and power and mutually assured destruction and first strike capabilities and China's 250 nuclear warheads and Russia's 4,000 and our benevolent countries more than 5,000. And that says nothing of India and Israel and Pakistan and North Korea. Who knows what they're up to? A rose is a rose is a rose. Yes, a rose grows naturally from the earth. A rose is warmed by the sun's heat and sends its scent into the air we breathe. A bomb is a bomb is a bomb is not of the earth. It is a made thing, made by us, by you and me. We transport it. We threaten to drop it on others, have dropped it on others, as if they were not flesh and blood like us. What is its beauty? Deformity and death. What is its scent? Obscenity. And why are we slaves to our own creation? We live in the same world, Paul. A poem is not a bomb. A poem is a song when it needs to. A poem is a song of gratitude. A poem is a song of gratitude for life. A poem will scream when it needs and console when it can. A poem will waken us to the ugliness and squalor that is of our own making, just like the bomb. A poem gives voice to the better angels of our nature, to what we are all capable of. A poem will waken us from our loss of wonder and from our complacency. A poem reminds us of the capacity we have for courage to oppose what would destroy us, namely ourselves, and move us together, you and me, Paul, beyond grief and despair. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Merrill. All I can say is power to the poem, and it's going to be a tough act to follow. I mean, really done from the heart. At this point, I think we're going to go into our little presentation of some history, and to do that, we're having Nancy Abbott Young, who's on the board of directors of Historic Tacoma, and is the daughter of Tacoma Park's most famous mayor, Sammy Abbott.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you see? Can you see?
We've put together, I guess you call it a PowerPoint. We wanted to do a retrospective of the earliest history of the nuclear freeze movement first, to give you some historical background and to help you understand what went on before there was the first resolution and the first committee and so on during the Reagan years.
You have the clicker.
Oh, the clicker, sorry.
In 1982, Tacoma Park joined 370 other city councils around the nation to pass a resolution for a bilateral, mutually verifiable freeze on nuclear weapons. Then, a year and a half later, on December 8th, 1983, right here where we're speaking, and Tacoma Park passed our own remarkable nuclear-free zone ordinance, which has lasted 3 decades and is still going strong. Tacoma Park was part of a massive global movement that galvanized during the Reagan years as a response to the Cold War arms buildup between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Millions of people worldwide worked tirelessly on this issue. For us in Tacoma Park, living inside the Beltway in an area that Civil Defense labeled Ground Zero made it a very local issue. Our ordinance is like many others in that it prohibits the production, storage, and transport of nuclear weapons or parts of them within the jurisdiction. But it goes way beyond that to include 2 remarkable concepts: divestiture of financial dealings with nuclear weapon producers, modeled on the anti-apartheid divestiture of the same decade, and the socially responsible investment policy. In this regard, our ordinance was truly unique, the first of its kind, not just in the nation, but probably in the world, to hitch its finances to a political will.
And I've been asked to speak specifically about the role that my dad, Sam Abbott, who was the mayor of Tacoma Park during 1980 and 285, played in the movement. And first, I wanted to kind of call out the names of many other people, some of whom are no longer with us or have moved to other states. Dean Hoagie, Reverend George Taylor, Sharon Levy, Lynn Bradley, my sister Susan Abbott, my mom, Ruth Abbott, Sue Wheaton and Phil Wheaton, Bob Alpern, Michael Hasty, Jerry McClurkin, and many others. The New Abolitionist newspaper, the rag of the Freeze movement, said that my dad was certainly the most outspoken elected official the nuclear free zone movement has ever known, and he really did grab onto this issue and wouldn't let it go. To discuss why Sam felt so strongly about this, I have to go back to his experience in World War II, which affected him deeply. He was a painter, and he recorded his experiences in paintings. Fallen planes. He was in intelligence, actually, cartographer on the German border. Bombed out cities. This is Bayreuth, Germany. Civilians seeking shelter during air raids. This is on a very, very thin piece of tracing paper that I found in the basement, and it says at the bottom either Berlin or London. And the specter of Hitler, the horrors of war. Later, when challenged about his public stance on nuclear war, he said, "I put in my time during World War II, and I don't think there's any way whatsoever that nuclear arms can be viewed as a means of preserving this country." This is a pen and ink drawing of a larger painting. I would have brought it, but the rain prohibited. It's huge. This is my father's concept of Edward Teller, the father of the A-bomb, guarding his fallout shelter from the destruction that he's wrought above. The painting, I'll bring it back and put it on display at some point. Teller was one scientist, but Bertrand Russell and many Nobel laureates were other scientists who came out with a peace declaration. My dad was very supportive of that in the 50s and organized to get other people to sign. It was the Einstein-Russell resolution for peace by these scientists who had helped create this, what they considered a monster. My dad, by the way, he felt that was one of the reasons he was blacklisted later. He opposed the Vietnam War, especially the strategy we have to destroy Vietnam in order to save it. Dad didn't run for public office until 1978. He was 72. He was urged to run by a constituency of local activists who participated in the North Central Freeway fight, the anti-war movement, and a multitude of other local issues. He lost his first race by 8 votes, but won in a landslide 2 years later. He served 3 terms. He also did a lot of what he used to call chalk talks, which were basically sketches, and when he talked to the powers that be, he'd always have his, if anyone remembers, some of us were there. He always had this big, papers that he would have prepared in our living room ahead of time, and then he'd talk from them. So this was the Pentagon, 1982 to 89. This is trickle-down economics with localities like Tacoma Park at the very bottom. He took the unlikely position to think globally and act locally, but as Jay alluded to earlier, here in the shadow of the nation's capital, that distinction is very thin. He said nuclear disarmament is too important to leave to the national government. Imagine what we could do with the money here in the cities if we could use it to be what's being spent on the military. I think the real issue is survival for cities. Even if no bomb goes off, the arms race is going to kill us financially.
Fortunately, at the same time that the military budget was building, a remarkable mass movement for a bilateral nuclear freeze was also building great momentum. During 1982, something occurred that raised public awareness about the risks of a buildup in nuclear arms right here inside the Beltway. Civil defense planners in FEMA, which considered the White House to be ground zero, announced a plan to evacuate more than 3 million residents of the Washington metropolitan area to Virginia and West Virginia on 6 major highways within 72 hours. The plans were predicated on 3 to 5 days' notice, cars with tags ending in even numbers leaving on the first day, cars with odd number tags leaving on the second day. You could bring survival essentials only, 3 days of food and water, vital documents, but pets had to be left behind. People were told to bring shovels because they need them to build their own shelters when they arrive somewhere in West Virginia. Meanwhile, a massive bunker right here in Olney was to serve as command and control center, sheltering 400 essential government officials for 30 days.
And Sam was on the board of directors of COG, the Metropolitan Council of Governments at the time, and he brought a resolution to his fellow elected officials from Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, calling on them to reject the civil defense plans, hold public hearings, and support a bilateral, mutually verifiable nuclear freeze between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The COG resolution was initially tabled, but it was later reconsidered and passed by a vote of 12-3.
Meanwhile, for 2 years after the very active Nuclear Freeze Task Force had been working on a plan to strengthen the original 1982 freeze ordinance with a more specific ordinance creating a nuclear-free zone. A public hearing was followed by a unanimous vote by the Council on December 8th, 1983, 30 years ago. Tacoma Park thus joined 32 other such nuclear-free zones in the United States, including 3 in Maryland, Wild Lake in Columbia, Garrett Park, and Sykesville.
This is the article from the Washington Post that came out right after the vote. The press coverage, what I found really fascinating when I went back to research this period was that we had a really active local press. We don't have that now, but on this issue, for instance, there's the Washington Post, the Montgomery Journal, the PG Journal again, everybody had their angle. The Washington Times. This is the Montgomery Journal, the Baltimore Sun. And in these times, which was, again, an alternative magazine, wrote, in a move that brings the mega numbers of the arms race down to human scale, President Reagan recently installed a handful of surface-to-air missiles around the White House to protect the first family from attack. Seeing safety differently, the City Council in the neighboring town of Tacoma Park, Maryland, unanimously passed a nuclear-free zone act outlawing production or work on nuclear weapons within city limits.
We were also receiving invitations from other cities, such as these 2 in England, Crawley and Sussex, to join them as sister cities, though we were not very successful at the time in finding a counterpart sister city in the Soviet Union, as was mandated in the Nuclear Free Zone Ordinance. The nuclear free movement was very well organized by then, and this was before the digital era. So instead of emails, tweets, and Facebook and cell phones, we relied on face-to-face communications at meetings and events like this one. There were numerous teach-ins and film showings.
And just as the scientists and the physicians and the psychologists and other professionals organized themselves and spoke out against the buildup of a nuclear arsenal and this so-called survivability concept, teachers and artists were also lending their time and talents to the freeze movement. This is by calligraphers and numerous musicians, rock musicians, but also classical musicians. In 1984, the local freeze movement invited Maestro Leonard Bernstein and Musicians Against Nuclear Arms to Washington. This is our Tacoma resident Marilyn Kaufman's sketch of Leonard Bernstein conducting Mahler's Ninth Symphony. Jesse Norman and Barbara Hendricks sang, and this was a very heady moment for the movement. We were tired, especially after organizing this.
Within a year of the passage of our nuclear free zone ordinance here, the law met its first challenge. The police department needed new radios, and the two main suppliers were GE, which was invested in the MX missile and B-52 production, and Motorola, which was also invested in the Minuteman missiles and the B-52s. The task force went to work researching lower frequency alternatives for the radios, and the use of a waiver to purchase in case of an emergency was on the table. The local press was very active and published full banner articles, conflicting editorials, and an array of cartoons. Here's the PG Sentinel. Got a cartoon?
Not yet,
Okay.
but we have a quote from Peter Franchot.
Okay. The Montgomery Journal, with a quote from Peter Franchot, read, Peter was working at the time, he's now a controller, he was working with Congressman Markey, Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and he spoke out against this waiver. Unfortunately, the waiver did pass by a vote of 5-2.
When the waiver passed, the cartoonists
Oh,
went
listen.
wild, and here's some samples. But, you know, it made for a lively press and a good debate. And my dad wrote this letter to the editor with a sketch of two overly armed gladiators in a standoff. And this, in the end, the PG Post summed it up: Tacoma Park remains a nuclear-free zone. We hope it proves not to be such in name only.
Interestingly, the PG Post was more liberal than the Montgomery Journal. In 1984, shortly after Congressman Steny Hoyer was invited to speak at the Martin Luther King commemoration, he voted in favor of an appropriation of $1.5 billion for 21 MX missiles. As a result, Sammy Abbott disinvited Hoyer to speak at the King commemoration. This created a fissure in the city council here, with some members sending an apology to Hoyer. Well, Sam didn't apologize, but he did invite Hoyer back to speak on another occasion, where he defended his vote, saying the MX is a very powerful, effective weapon system critical to the arms negotiation process. Meanwhile, Tacoma Park was visited by another congressman around the same time. That was Representative Ed Markey, the staunchest and most fearless supporter of a bilateral freeze in Congress. He's now a senator from Massachusetts.
Yeah, he was wonderful. I remember when he came. My dad was invited by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to, with other mayors, attend the First World Conference of Mayors for Peace through Inter-City Solidarity, and to describe to the International Declaration of Peace. This was a very profound experience for him, and he presented his hosts with a print of that Teller painting and made them honorary citizens of Tacoma Park. Shortly thereafter, he lost in the next race for mayor. It was a 7-vote margin. And I like this cartoon. Nuclear Free Zone, Amnesty Sanctuary, and in 1985, a bullet ban.
Well, the new mayor of Tacoma Park was Stephen Del Giudice, and he immediately faced a second challenge to the nuclear-free zone ordinance. This time, the issue was purchase of patrol cars. There were problems with the city's Chrysler patrol cars, and the proposed Chevys and Fords to take its place were encumbered with connections to nuclear weapons manufacturers, and Volvos were considered way too expensive. Again, hearings were held and the issue was debated. By a vote of 4-3 at midnight, the waiver was defeated and the city stuck with Chrysler's, and the nuclear-free zone ordinance survived intact.
Sam passed away on December 15, 1990, at age 82. It was on the eve of the Persian Gulf War. He spent the last decades of his life fighting for quality of life in Tacoma Park, and he was active on every conceivable issue of the day which impacted our community, including bilateral nuclear disarmament. His favorite quote was from Dante: "The hottest places in hell have been reserved for those who in periods of greatest crisis have maintained their neutrality." And I end back at the beginning. This is our own resolution, and the third finding. In view of the Nuremberg principles, which hold individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, and the illegality of nuclear weapons under international law, in adopting this ordinance, this community seeks to end its complicity with preparations for fighting a nuclear war.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, after this heavy subject, we're going to have a little music interlude, and we're very lucky to have Ladle Fight. Now, Ladle Fight, believe it or not, is a local group. They have been at the Fillmore East performing, and they're all Tacoma Park residents. And while they're setting up, I'd just like to mention that when we passed the nuclear-free zone ordinance here in 1983, there were 150 people in the room, the biggest public hearing and vote ever in the city. And we're not only famous right here in the area, but the fact is that people around the world know about this nuclear-free zone. I was lucky enough to be in Hiroshima and Nagasaki representing Tacoma Park at a Mayors for Peace conference where I spoke before a huge conglomeration of probably half the people didn't speak English, but anyway. And I've spoken at the UN and at a World Peace Conference in Vancouver, much to the amazement of a large portion of these audiences who didn't realize that our nuclear-free zone is the strongest, and as I say, has lasted for 30 years. So these three guys, we have Ben Miller, Ian Askew, and Zeke Wapner. And you guys ready to go? Sorry.
cope with this heavy load, trying to touch and reach you with heart and soul. Give me love, give me peace on earth, give me life, keep me free from birth. Give me hope, help me cope with this heavy load, trying to touch and reach you with heart and soul. Oh, my Lord. Take hold of my hand, that I might understand you. Won't you please, oh, won't you give me love? Thank you. We're Little Fight. Thank you, Nancy, for inviting us. This is an awesome event.
Thank you, Ladle Fight, and they're at ladlefight.com. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Good. While they're getting ready, I just want to tell you that you probably couldn't read some of the comments when we passed the resolution, comments online, not online, on the newspapers. They included that we were anti-nuclear zealots, latter-day flower children, endowed with leather lungs, and we operated with mob intimidation when the city council passed a resolution 7-0. Anyway, some of the things that the Nuclear Free Zone Committee has done over the years are educational exhibits here in the Municipal Center. That caused quite a controversy because some of the exhibits showed the results of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And some people complained that it was not proper to show that in public. Well, I think the government wanted to hide it in 1945, and they still want to hide it, but we showed it. We've also promoted film festivals, cable TV events. We've had July 4th floats, street and folk festival presentations, and Hiroshima Day observance on August 8th. This has been over the years. We've also had an effect on other communities around the country. Olympia, Washington, the capital of the state of Washington, it's a good trivia question, nobody knows that, passed a similar ordinance. Oakland, Berkeley, Boulder, and I believe Massachusetts, where's Harvard? Cambridge, among others. So our next presentation is going to be the Sam Abbott Living Legacy Award. You're going to introduce yourself here.
I'm Ann Slayton. I'm with Historic Tacoma, and I just want to tell you a little bit about what we've been up to with one of our new projects. We've decided to put together upwards of a half a dozen different public programs that go back and show the legacy that Sam Abbott left to us over the years, which is huge. Nancy said earlier that Sam got a hold of this issue and didn't let it go. It's very true. He got a hold of a lot of issues and didn't let them go. And we're going to try to bring some of that out. For instance, with his real interest in maintaining the communities and the roads and the spirit of Tacoma Park, and by stopping the North Central Freeway, was that it, really? And you know, the interesting thing, it's not just them that we're looking at as Historic Tacoma, but a lot of these issues, they're still ongoing. They're here with us today. The Metro site, for instance, right now, as we speak, is probably going to be developed. We've been involved in presenting testimony and educating neighbors about, you know, how how that's going to go and how we want really to preserve our green space. So, that's an example of the kinds of evolution that some of these issues, it's like what goes around comes around, and they're still here with us today. One of the ones that I was particularly, and my husband Merrill were involved in when we first moved to Tacoma Park, again, a SAMI project, was Montgomery County came along and decided it was going to close our junior high school for good. This was about the same time. It might have been a year or two earlier. And we fought that, and we gave testimony to county council and school boards, went on for a while, and we saved our school. And sure enough, Montgomery County comes along and builds us a new school in the same spot, in the middle school. So that's another issue that we're going to hope to present as part of this project. But what I want to do tonight is present our first SAMI Award. And Jay Levy, would you please come up? Yes, you. Okay, here you go. I'm going to read it out. Thus, Mayor Sam Abbott Living Legacy Project of Historic Tacoma honors Jay Levy with a SAMI Award for your tireless efforts over the last 3 decades toward the creation and protection of our city's nuclear-free zone ordinance and your passionate commitment to nuclear disarmament and a world that solves its conflicts through peaceful means. In the spirit of activist Mayor Sam Abbott, with whom you worked for local solution to global threat of nuclear war and mutually assured destruction, we honor you today as a local hero. We encourage others to follow your example.
Well, I don't know what to say, but I do enjoy being here in Tacoma Park, as I've lived for the last 37 years, and I hope to see us continue to fight the good fight. The city hasn't lost its heart. I mean, we've been a sanctuary city. We were one of the first cities to do that. We're not allowed to cut a tree down without a permit, and it's pretty hard to get a permit. So I think we're basically on the right track, and thank you very much to the Abbott family, Historic Tacoma, and anybody else who is involved. At this point, we're going to show a clip, and I don't have my notes because what this is a production for PBS that was not allowed to be shown on PBS. And it's called Nuclear Savage, The Islands of Secret Project. This is the documentary by a Santa Fe, New Mexico filmmaker. It was commissioned by PBS, finished 2 years ago. We're going to show you a clip, but they never aired it. And the documentary maker believes that suppression is political because of the controversial content of this film. Between 1946 and 1958, U.S. conducted 67 large-scale nuclear tests on the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. Military airplanes dropped and detonated a hydrogen bomb over 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. Despite official claims that the wind unexpectedly changed direction on the day of the Bravo blast, the research reveals that the U.S. government intentionally proceeded in order to study the lingering effects of the contamination on the people who lived in that area. The documentary filmmaker points out they destroyed an entire country that we were not at war with, that we were at peace with. Not only did they blow up all these islands, but they purposely contaminated all these people as human experiments. This film will be shown in its entirety here in Washington, D.C. on the evening of February 11th at the Goethe Institute downtown as part of the Uranium Film Festival. We encourage you to see it, and we'll be contacting you with information on that and other excellent films that will be part of the festival. Some of the material here will be quite disturbing, but very relevant.
powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes.
Yes, I had a dream at the same time, the bright white. I was dreaming that I was in the middle of all the fire, things fall down from the sky, and when they hit the ground, that was a fire.
Vào chờ lại cái này rồi cái việc nữa là không chịu đừng rồi cái việc kia đến rồi chờ lại tayo any walo ka lang nga rin cho pa mo ang yung mga rekatasa pa.
Stabbing at me just like a dog.
Dinuro, bang dapat, wala kuan parang, agil kuala, agil kilip. Padawi ayam jala kan minay yar beri, bayiri.
I see memories out of the past, memories that always will last. All that place across the sea.
They have burned the people from Rongelapet, burn all over the neck, legs, and arms, and hair fall off. If it was an accident, they should have taken action right away to evacuate the people from Rongelapet. But they didn't.
I wonder if they will tell you about Project 4.1, the study of humans exposed to radiation, drawn in 1953 for the planned 1954 Castle nuclear test series. Project 4.1 contemplated the study of exposed human beings.
The Marshallese caught by fallout got 175 roentgens of radiation. These are fishing people, savages by our standards. So a cross-section was brought to Chicago for testing. The first was John, the mayor of Rongelap Atoll. John, as we said, is a savage, but a happy, amenable savage. The Iron Room is a radiation detector for human beings. One dot, one gamma ray.
Rolla, number 40. That was his guinea pig number. 2 of those numbers were assigned to fetuses.
The United States deeply regrets the hardships the peoples of the 4 atolls have endured as a result of the testing program, as well as the accidental downwind injuries caused by one test, Bravo.
The American representatives to this day are talking about the accident that occurred, meaning Bravo, when all the documents today indicate that there was no accident.
Would it be possible to do an interview with you at some point to talk about U.S. government policy?
Probably not.
And why is that?
Well, maybe we could turn the camera off and we can have a little chat.
Why would we pick these idyllic islands?
Inhabited islands. That, for the life of me, I will never be able to understand.
The building, what is inside?
I don't know. Justice.
Justice? That's good.
I think that gives us something to reflect on, and if you're interested, we can post the date and time of the full-length documentary. Right now, we're going to bring you up to date on what's been happening with the development of our nuclear weapons around the world. We have Keith Martin, who is on the right. He is Executive Director of Peace Action and the Peace Action Education Fund, located right down the road here in downtown Silver Spring. Peace Action is a grassroots national organization. It's the largest of its kind, and it grew out of the Sane Freeze Group movement to end nuclear armament. And Keith is going to speak a little bit about what's going on today.
Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here, and my own personal activism in nuclear disarmament work started about 30 years ago in Washington, D.C., so I remember very well the establishment of the nuclear weapons-free zone here. I have a little audience participation game to start off with. I'm going to name a bunch of countries, and some of you, this is probably a pretty erudite audience. You're probably going to figure out what I'm doing. But if you just play along, I'm going to name a bunch of countries, and if you're interested in representing this country, stand up. It could be a country you've been to that you really like a lot, or a country maybe you don't like so much, or your own heritage maybe is from this country. I'm going to be the United States. I'm going to stand up and be the United States, which I don't particularly, I'm not really comfortable representing the United States for a lot of reasons, but I am. China, who'd like to be China? Anybody who's been to China or has Chinese heritage or anything like that? Okay, you're China. Stand up right over there. You're China. Russia. I'm sure there must be people here with Russian heritage. Who would like to be, or who's traveled to Russia? Somebody must want to be Russia. You want to be Russia? Yeah, you. I'm talking to you. Yeah. All right, you're Russia. United Kingdom. Who wants to be the United Kingdom? Somebody stand up and be the United Kingdom. Paul's United Kingdom. Excellent, because his wife's from the United Kingdom. France. Who wants to be France? Anybody speak French? Anybody have French heritage? Somebody must want to be France. Oh, excellent. Saudi Arabia, all that oil money. Who wants to be Saudi Arabia for a minute? I don't know that you really would rub off on you or anything like that. Kevin, you're Saudi Arabia. How about you? Okay. India. Anybody been to India? Have Indian heritage? Like Gandhi and his spirit? Who wants to be Indian?
I like Indian food.
Indian food. There you go. Okay. Let's see. Germany. There must be people with German heritage or have been to Germany. Somebody wants to be Germany, right? Who wants to be Germany? You can be Germany, can't you? Okay. Excellent. We just have a couple more to go here. Italy. Italia. Who likes Italian food or has Italian heritage? Okay, you can be Italy then. Okay, so you're Italy. Let's see, Brazil. Who wants to be Brazil? Host of the upcoming, if people don't continue dying from building the stadiums down there. Brazil. Okay, and last one is South Korea. Anybody want to be South Korea? I don't know why everybody on that side of the room a little bit. How about you? You can be South Korea. There you go. Stand up. You're South Korea. Come on. There you go. Okay. Now, if we were in a closer circle, I would sort of segregate people by countries, but I'm not going to do that. So the United States represents something that all these other countries put together represent. Does anybody know what that is? Military spending. Who said that? You got that? Excellent. The United States spends as much on the military as the next 11 countries combined. Now, if you think you are an ally of the United States or a country that's friendly to the United States, then sit down. Formally or informally. I hope you're Russia, because if you're the USSR, you're living way in the past. Okay, so who are you? Are you Russia? And who are you? China. Okay, so this is not unintentional. The United States military budget now is meant to isolate Russia and China, and with all those other countries that are mostly our allies. Now, that's overall military spending. And if you look at some of the most best sources, it'll show about $700 billion a year. But if you look at what's actually called national security spending, it's about $1 trillion a year that the United States spends. Now, if you're looking at just nuclear weapons spending, often, again, it'll say about $30 billion. It's actually about $60 billion, which is more than the entire military budgets of all of those countries except for the top 5, down to Japan. Okay, you can sit down. Thank you very much. So, you can sit, yes. Thank you. So that's really pretty remarkable, not just the absurd level of U.S. military spending compared to the next 11 countries combined, and it's over about 45% of total global military spending, because after that it goes down a lot more. But the United States now is spending about $60 billion a year just on nuclear weapons-related spending. And this includes environmental cleanup and health, which we should be doing a much better job by the people of the Marshall Islands on, for example, but also downwinders in this country, uranium miners, etc. So the cleanup and health costs, the actual nuclear weapons forces themselves, so-called missile defense, because it doesn't defend anybody from anything other than the contractor's bottom line. That's the only thing that missile defense defends. There is no such thing as missile defense. And what they call nuclear threat reduction, which is mostly non-proliferation programs and basically trying to keep our weapons from blowing up accidentally. Now, what is even more egregious than all of that is that in order to get a very modest treaty reducing nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Russia a few years ago, the Obama administration had to pay a terrible ransom, which we're going to have to fight, which is so-called modernization of our nuclear weapons program, soup to nuts. Everything from the bombs themselves to the production factories to the bombs and missiles and submarines. Just that quote-unquote modernization is supposed to be about $200 billion over the next 10 years. But that will be low, right? Because these programs never come in on time and on budget. That $200 billion is probably far understated. $200 billion over the next 10 years. And so not only was that hypocritical to non-proliferation and to the spirit of the treaty with Russia, which was, again, a modest reduction in our nuclear weapons forces, now, since that, every other nuclear weapons state have said that they are also going to modernize their forces. So there's a very bad monkey see, monkey do dynamic there. In terms of overall nuclear arsenals, Russia has a few more weapons than we do, just a few numbers. You can look this up online. There's a lot of good sources for this. Russia has about 8,500 nuclear weapons. United States about 7,700, and of that 7,700, about 5,000 are the most awful strategic and deployed nuclear weapons, most of them still on high alert status. President Obama hasn't even been able to take the simple step of what they call de-alerting, reducing the alert status. The best thing to do would actually be to take the warheads off of the missiles or the planes or the submarines. France about 300, China about 250, the UK 225, Pakistan and India a little over 100 each, Israel 80, but I actually think that's low. I think it's probably more like 200, and North Korea probably fewer than 10. So over 17,000 nuclear weapons still in the world's arsenals this long after the end of the Cold War. The vast majority, practically 90% of Russia and the United States. Now, in terms of the situation of kind of the movement or the dynamic in this country on nuclear disarmament, I would have to say that despite having a president who, at least rhetorically, is probably the most committed to nuclear disarmament since John Kennedy, we've made very little progress, very disappointing progress, and I would think that when the president leaves after 8 years, there are going to be a lot of disappointments to look back at, but I think this will probably be one of the biggest, that we haven't been able to move further towards nuclear disarmament. We can't even get the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty ratified through the United States Senate, this nuclear modernization spending that I talked about. And just in general, the issue is not really a very high-profile issue, even in the peace movement. I mean, my organization, Peace Action, which goes back to SANE and the Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign, this is our legacy issue. We've been around for 56 years. I personally have worked with the organization in some form or another for 28 years, so for half of that lifetime. And frankly, we spend a lot less of our time on nuclear disarmament issues than we do on a lot of other things. Iraq, Afghanistan, military budget as a whole, increasingly things like drones, certainly most recently working to prevent a war with Iran. There just is really not a lot of traction or momentum on the issue. However, when you look internationally, I believe that there is more reason to be hopeful. There's a lot of countries now that are just sick and tired of the United States and the other nuclear weapons states and their sclerosis or constipation in the sort of normal channels of nuclear disarmament negotiations. So earlier this year, the Norwegian government hosted a conference in Oslo on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And for a lot of us that have worked on this issue for a long time, we're like, well, no duh. Like, does anybody think nuclear weapons are benign or that there wouldn't be horrific humanitarian consequences? The thing is, a lot of people, especially younger people, have not grown up with the awareness of nuclear weapons and how horrific they are. And so there's a need to sort of help to educate a new generation of people that don't understand, because nuclear weapons have somehow just been legitimized as if they're part of the furniture in the room instead of a horrific danger to life on the planet. There's going to be a follow-up conference again on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in Mexico. The United States didn't even go to the last one that was in Norway. And this film about the Marshall Islands and I can't wait to see it, and I'll actually be at the film festival in February. But in late September, I was at the United Nations, and there was the first ever high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly. And all these countries, and actually the first speaker was the president of Iran, because Iran is currently the chair of the non-aligned movement. All these countries talking about, we should get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, the one that I think has among the most integrity to be speaking about that was the representative from the Marshall Islands. And I think it was very moving. A lot of these are sort of pro forma government speeches, and they drone on all day long. It was very moving. I had tears in my eyes listening to the representative from the Marshall Islands talk about the need to abolish nuclear weapons. The upcoming Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference next 2015, where we deal with both nuclear weapons issues and nuclear power issues. Not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but Peace Action and our allies both in this country and around the world will be working to press the United States and the other nuclear powers. And I think there's a certain amount that we can do as people in this country, as voters, et cetera, to demand more progress in terms of nuclear disarmament, but making common cause with governments and NGOs from around the world that are pressing harder. And one of the most important things that we can be raising now is the need for not just a nuclear-free zone, but a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. Because there is one nuclear power in the Middle East, and it's not Iran, it's Israel. And that's a huge problem, and that's just not a sustainable situation. I want to leave you with something that I think is particularly germane, and this also is exciting to me because it's recognizing newer style of organizer, not newer, but organizing that's getting more traction in other movements, including the movement for justice for the people of Palestine, but also movements for boycott and divestment of companies that are benefiting from evil practices. And it's most directly germane to the Nuclear Free Zone Ordinance. This is called Don't Bank on the Bomb, and if you just Google that, it's an extensive report not only of all the international nuclear weapons producers, all of them except China. In China, they're public, or they're government companies, but all the other nuclear weapon states, the United States and every other nuclear weapon state has private companies that are the contractors that build the nuclear weapons. Well, this report, Don't Bank on the Bomb, not only points that out, but it points out all the banks, all the insurance companies, and all the investment houses that do business with those companies. So you can pull your money not just out of Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin, whoever, which probably none of you are invested in anyway, and they don't have many consumer products that you can choose to boycott. However, if you look at the list, it's pretty much all the big banks, all the big insurance companies, and most of the major investment firms do have investments and do business with nuclear weapons corporations. So this is a very powerful, I think, both education and action tool. Again, it's called Don't Bank on the Bomb, and it's something that we're helping to promote as well. I think the last thing that I would just like to say in terms of the current status of our movement and moving forward in this country, and certainly I think this should strike a chord with people here in Takoma Park, is one of, I think, the shortest and most accurate quotes by Martin Luther King, which is, those of us who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. And I think if other towns, more and more towns around the country, took the advantage, or took the good advantage of both materials and the example of places like Takoma Park, then we would be doing a much better job of organizing as effectively as those who love war. So thanks for all you do, and thanks for being here to honor this 30th anniversary tonight.
Thank you very much, Kevin. At this point, I'd like to introduce our member of the Nuclear Free Zone Committee, but he's also the Director of Research Oversight at Takoma Park Zone Beyond Nuclear. This is an organization which is making the connections between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. As the committee has done, we were asked by the City Council to make a recommendation on nuclear power vis-a-vis the city. And our recommendation was cut it out, and the city has done that. Takoma Park is 100% wind power supplied now. And anyway, Paul Gunter is going to speak to you about the connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power.
Thank you, Jay. My name, again, is Paul Gunter. I'm Director of Reactor Oversight at Beyond Nuclear over on Carroll Avenue. And we're an advocacy group for communities around the United States that are facing nuclear power issues, nuclear waste issues. And I want to basically start out by saying that what Takoma Park has done is literally to take on, act locally, think globally on a very particularly important issue that affects not only peace, but climate change and democracy. And so it's particularly rewarding to be a part of a community that has made a decision rooted in democracy and democratic decision-making that is supported by ethical government. And so I think that we all should be proud of the fact that we are acting locally, thinking globally, and where we're now demonstrating that community action can make a difference, where locally generated transparency is opening windows and doors into national policy that affect world peace. And while it may seem to be a small, isolated effort that we are a part of, these are and continue to be important steps that we serve as an example and as a community that is united in taking these steps forward. I wanted to take just a moment to update you on where we stand right now as the city committee. We've been doing research now for the last year to come up with options for the city council to take action on in January, where we will be acting together to enhance the ability to look at city contracts, to look at city investments, and to provide that transparency so that we can be compliant with our law. And so we're now presenting, we have presented the City Council with 3 options. The first option to enhance our Nuclear Free Zone Act is a subscription service through Bloomberg Government, which has a database that is available for researching all city contracts to see if they are invested in or part of the production network or have money involved in nuclear weapons contracting. And so this is option one that the city will be looking at in one of the January meetings that's coming up. Option two is a socially responsible investment network that is based in New York, MSCI. They are basically the investment network used by such financial institutions as the Calvert Fund, other institutions that look at ethical investment, particularly with controversial weapon systems, landmines, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons. So that's option two that the city will be looking at, which again is a subscription service that would provide spreadsheets to city government that would list nuclear weapons contractors where investments are made right now, and that the city can then match its contracts and investments against this vetted list. The third option is an effort that's been presented by Charles Johnson out in Oregon, who was one of the original founders of the Nuclear Free America organization, which published a list that was used for many of the nuclear free communities around the country. The Nuclear Free America subscription service expired in 2006, but they're now talking about reinstituting the subscription service. So we will be presenting those three options to the city with a recommendation probably this month, but certainly for the January meeting. But the issue is becoming increasingly more important because we now all understand that uranium is the currency of a coin whose flip side is nuclear waste and on the other nuclear weapons. And the trafficking of so-called civilian nuclear power ultimately is the transfer for the building blocks for the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So the fact that the city of Tacoma Park has taken a consistent stand to oppose both nuclear weapons and nuclear power really empowers our community as an example to take forward and to continue to take forward, not only within the United States, but around the world. And I believe that we carry this mantle. We look to and enhance our service in making this very complicated and increasingly dangerous issue more transparent. I was just at a conference that was put on by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just last month. And one of the issues that came up that Kevin outlined in his presentation is that the generations that are coming now have taken the presence of nuclear weapons and to some degree nuclear power as a given. And at the same time that we take nuclear destruction for granted, these systems are aging and deteriorating and becoming ever more dangerous. And so the responsibility for making our communities and our country and our policies, both peace and energy, more attuned to the nuclear danger is really a responsibility that has to come locally and to generate a global policy. But clearly, I'm really proud, we're all really proud that Tacoma Park has taken this position where this building is covered in solar panels. Many of the city's other outbuildings are solar powered and generating net metering electricity. We're also purchasing renewable energy power. We're making an example for sustainable renewable energy policy a local issue where it's the local right choice for the globally responsible choice. And so this is a really important principle that we take up here. But clearly, Tacoma Park is linking local energy policy to world peace, to climate change, and to responsible consumers and environmental stewards. So I think that we all have an important role, and we should all applaud ourselves in that effort as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to have a brief Q&A, and then we'll conclude with a song from Tacoma Park's Troubadour Laureate, or anyway. Anybody have any questions for the panel, or let me...
Hi, there are two comments where this has touches me personally. I was rather shocked about it. But I went into my dentist for a toxic metals hair test, and my uranium came up extremely high. And I asked, I'm involved in mercury detox, as many of us had who had our silver fillings, which are 50% mercury. And so that came up unexpectedly high, and my healthcare practitioner dismissed it. And so it said, oh, everybody's very high now. So this is all in our bodies, and there is something called EDTA, which can remove uranium from the body. So that's just something to think about and look into. It's all poisoning us right now, all of us. And the second thing is that we will have a county council candidate this coming year from the Green Party, Tim Willard, who I believe would be willing to push Montgomery County to adopt the nuclear-free Tacoma Park policies. And Dan Robinson, who many of you might know, was on Tacoma Park City Council. He's running for state delegate. And we have a candidate, George Gluck, who's running in District 6, which I think is somewhat the northern part. And I believe all three of those candidates would be for expanding this, because clearly this has to grow.
One thing that's a sort of trivia that it's that the United States ended above-ground nuclear testing in 1963. Well, I was born in 1962. And so people that were born around that time or before that or even slightly after that have traces of strontium-90 in our bones from that above-ground nuclear testing. And I was born and grew up in Pennsylvania. I was nowhere near the Nevada test site. So we are all from that period, downwinders.
Again, I'm going to introduce my colleague Kevin Camps from Beyond Nuclear to talk a little about the most obvious connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and that is nuclear waste.
Well, just to bring it, hi everybody, just to bring it close to home for folks in Tacoma Park and Silver Spring, there's a U.S. Senate bill, S-1240. It's called the Nuclear Waste Administration Act of 2013, and it could be voted on in committee in January. It was going to be on December 19th, but it's been postponed. What it would do is prioritize centralized interim storage for high-level radioactive waste from commercial reactors like Calvert Cliffs on the Chesapeake Bay, North Anna, and Virginia. And if the Yucca Mountain transport routes hold, and they very likely would because they're going to target Native American reservations out west for these parking lot dumps, or Department of Energy facilities like Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, what it could mean for this area is radioactive waste trains passing through Tacoma Metro on the CSX lines that are parallel to the Metro lines there. So it has not passed committee, it has not passed the Senate, it hasn't passed Congress, it hasn't been signed into law, but we've got a fight on our hands. And so I just wanted to let people know that that's coming our way. And it's another one of these perpetual fights. We fight it session after session, but we've held it off for a very long time, for 20 years plus. So if folks could let their members of the U.S. Senate know what they think about such things, that'd be great.
My name is Hank Prensky. I served on the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee in 1985, 6, 7, like that. And I then subsequently ran for the city council, mostly because the city government was not taking seriously at that moment in time our nuclear-free zone ordinance. And I later served on the city council. One of the most exciting things I did in my time there was to represent the city at an international nuclear-free zone conference in Eugene, Oregon in 1989. And I want to offer you the best, most succinct sentence that I've ever heard about nuclear-free zones that helped me to explain to people who, when Nancy was speaking earlier, she talked about the demeaning way people talk about our nuclear-free zone, the demeaning way people talk about Tacoma Park. But the keynote of the conference was that we in the nuclear-free zone movement deny the profitability of the nuclear weapons industry. So you can use that to your benefit.
Thank you.
If Hank hadn't done that, I probably would have been quiet. I don't know whether to thank you or not. I'm Lynn Bradley, and I was on the council that passed it. And that reaction to, thank you. It was, the rooms were standing, this room was standing room only in those debates. And this should be standing room only if we're going to get really serious. So at the next meeting, we need to do that. And maybe I should do more to help in this age. I didn't mind being, quote, demeaned because it meant people noticed. And so there's nothing wrong with that. You know, like, so you passed the nuclear-free zone? Yes, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's the attitude that may still be around us. And we've got an even tougher national political situation now than we did even then. And I have a pointless story to tell. I was on a U.S. trip from the West Coast to Washington, back to Washington. I was knitting, and I was seated next, it was one of those great big planes. My two little kids were on the other side of the aisle, and there was the gentleman sitting next to me. We started chatting. And he said, well, he was going home back to Virginia. And I said, oh, I was going back to Maryland. And he said, where are you from? And I said, Tacoma Park. And he had already told me that he was a retired Air Force manpower specialist who was now working for like SRI or one of the big contract companies. And when I said I was from Tacoma Park, he said, well, I've studied that extensively. And I want to tell you, I don't understand how the town fathers, so remember, there's two issues going on here now, how the town fathers could possibly pass an ordinance like that. What do they know about nuclear, nuclear power, nuclear, bombs, this whole issue? And I said, well, who do you think you are? And I went, well, although it is largely symbolic, people are noticing, and this is a place in the stand to say, no, we have to stop this. And then he kept coming back about 3 or 4 times about, how could and he kept using this phrase, town fathers. So I was getting doubly mad. And finally I said something like, well, I was one of the town mothers. And he stopped talking to me, like from Denver further east. But clearly it had brought a lot of attention to people who we knew. And who knows, there's probably the NSA spying on us now. And I think some of these problems with drones, with this huge NSA business, these other things are all related to whatever dynamic goes on in our federal government, where the paranoia and the lack of responsiveness to what citizens want and why we have to organize better is so important. One last thing, I am a librarian, I lobby for library issues, and one of our huge issues is about access to government information and the transparency of what government does. And unless we have that, we can't find out what they're doing. And so while some of these issues may our eyes gloss over, that some of these things are very important because they tell us where the chemical manufacturing is, where the dumps are, what the other science and other research is showing. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Anybody else have any comments, questions, criticisms?
Just how has in numerics, I guess, since we got our zone together, and then you mentioned over the years other places around the U.S., Berkeley, Cambridge, and such. How has that changed over time, and where are we now vis-a-vis, percentage-wise, the country? Is there a long, long way to go, or have we, yeah?
Yes. Well, actually, again, Nuclear Free America stopped publishing its last list was published in 2006. So there has been, up until now, there's not been any updating of that list. So it's like that we went into cold storage a little bit, okay? Yeah. But the issue, of course, is ever more important now. So if you recall, another quick bit of history is that we did have a bit of a controversy just a couple of years ago with regard to Hewlett-Packard computers that came through to the library that didn't get checked against the list. And what it turns out is that Hewlett-Packard was on the old list, but they no longer do nuclear weapons contracts. And so without an updated list, we ran into this controversy, which actually then propelled the committee into updating and enhancing the service. And now we have presented the City Council with three very good options for redoubling our effort, for modernizing our service, for basically digital. This will now be a digitalized service rather than a printed list. It'll be a research search machine, so that we can actively go online and search, but also provide spreadsheets that look at this issue. So we're updating the ordinance, and both for research and for compliance. And then I hope that we can then work very diligently at encouraging other city councils to follow in the model, and also to inspire new city councils, new government agencies to then join us in this renewed effort.
One of the great things about that, just really quickly, from this report that I mentioned before, the Don't Bank on the Bomb, where again, it's not just the weapons contractors, but it's the banks, insurance companies, investment firms. So you pull out your credit cards or look at your mortgage or whatever, and you're probably doing business with some bank or insurance company or investment firm that does business with Nuclear Weapons Corporation. A member of ours out in Utah was very unhappy when she found out about this, and her family has had investments with Wells Fargo for a long time. Well, there's a lot of other reasons to boycott Wells Fargo as well as at Bank of America and a lot of these insurance companies. But that's actually a good thing in terms of democracy and transparency, and also making common cause with other movements that might want to boycott or divest some of these bad corporate actors. Anyway, she went into her Wells Fargo office, and they couldn't have been nicer. Oh, you've had your money with us forever. Is there more we could do in terms of customer service, blah, blah. And she said, no, I'm pulling my money out because you guys are invested in Lockheed Martin or whoever it is. And the people there, she must have been speaking Greek to them. They had no idea what was going on. So there's a lot before you actually make a dent in Wells Fargo to understand that, they should not be doing business with Lockheed Martin. But it has a lot to do with educating ourselves and also making common cause with other movements that would want to target a lot of these bad corporations for other reasons too.
We're going to close out tonight with a song from our Troubadour laureate and his accompanist, Jesse Paladowski and Cheryl Jones. And thank you, Paul and Kevin. And they will be around for...
Honored to be here tonight, Cheryl and I. It's proud accomplishment to have passed this 30 years ago. 30 years ago at this time, I was working on the Nuclear Freeze campaign in Michigan, getting a statewide ballot initiative. We're going to sing just a very short medley of 2 songs, one by Fred Small and one by John and Johanna Hall, and we'd welcome your participation in any way you'd like. Can I get a little less guitar on the monitor, please?
Give me the warm power of the sun. Give me the steady flow of a waterfall. Give me the spirit of living things as they turn to clay. Give me the restless power of the wind. Give me the comforting glow of the wood fire. But please take all your atomic poison power away. Everybody needs some power, I'm told, to shield us from the darkness and the cold. Some may buy, some may hold. When we are one, there's so much of life at stake. Yours and mine and our descendants in time. We know we to lose. We know every one of us has to choose. Give me the warm power of the sun. Give me the steady flow of a waterfall. Give me the spirit of living things as they return to clay. Give me the restless power of the wind. Give me the comforting glow of a wood fire. Take all your atomic poison power. I said, take all your atomic poison power. Take all your atomic poison power away. Peace is the bread we break. Love is the river rolling. Life is a chance we take. We make this earth our home. Gonna make this earth our home. Hear the cool breeze blowing through the smoke and the heat. Hear the gentle voices and the marching feet singing, call back the fire, draw the missiles down, and we'll call this earth our home. Peace is the bread we break. Peace is the bread we break. Love is the river rolling. Life is a chance we take. When we make this earth our home. Gonna make this earth our home.
Thank you all for coming. And one thing I should say, December 14th holds a very important date for the country of New Zealand, which declared itself a nuclear-free zone, and it took 8 years until December 14th, 19 years ago, until the U.S. would agree to abide by that, and any warship that comes to New Zealand will not have nuclear weapons. But it took 8 years to do that. And I want to thank you for coming. And if any of you are moved to want to join our forces, any Tacoma Park resident can join the Nuclear Free Zone Committee. We meet 6 times a year. Aside from special events, that's it. And you can see us afterward if you're interested. So thank you once again, and I hope to be here for the 40th.